Good morning and happy Earth Day to everyone who's joining us and to all of our panelists. And we have a great panel here today. So I thank you all for joining us. It is a privilege to open this conversation that sits at the intersection of some of the most urgent questions of our time: how we nourish a growing global population, how we sustain the planet that makes that nourishment possible, and how we ensure that access to nutritious food is equitable. We begin with a simple but sobering reality. Our food systems today are exceeding planetary boundaries. Let me repeat that. Our food systems today are exceeding planetary boundaries. Our food systems are placing unsustainable pressure on land, water, and climate systems at a moment when those systems are already under strain. At the same time, global demand for protein, and particularly animal protein, is rising, driven by population growth, urbanization, and increasing incomes. This is not a distant challenge. It is unfolding now across every region, wherever you sit in the world. And yet, even as demand grows, access remains profoundly unequal. For billions of people, the question is not which protein to choose, but it is whether they can afford any meaningful source of nutrition at all, including protein. So we're confronted with a dual imperative: to increase availability while reducing impact, and to do so in a way that closes, not widens, the access gap. Too often, this conversation has become polarized. One solution versus another, us versus them, framed as competing ideologies rather than shared challenges. Debates that pit those production systems against one another, or one dietary pathway against the rest. And these debates risk obscuring a more fundamental truth: no single solution will be sufficient. There's no singular answer to a challenge of this scale and complexity. What is required instead is a portfolio approach, one that recognizes the diversity of contexts, livelihoods, ecosystems, and cultures that shape how protein is produced and consumed around the world. An approach that allows for multiple pathways grounded in evidence, informed by lived realities, and open to innovation. It is in that spirit that we convene this dialogue today. We are pleased at FSF to do so together with ILRI, whose work grounds this conversation in real-world production systems and livelihoods across diverse regions. Their research and field experience help ensure that this discussion remains connected not only to global ambition, but to the practical realities faced by farmers, communities, and markets. Our goal today is not to advocate for a single pathway, but to create space for alignment across perspectives that are often placed in opposition, to better understand where the evidence leads, where trade-offs must be managed, and where opportunities for collaboration exist. So let me anchor our conversation with a question that is both simple and, I suspect, difficult for all of us to answer. What is required to produce protein for all within planetary boundaries? And if we can begin to answer that together, we will take an important step forward. And to help us answer that question today, I have an amazing panel. First, Brent Loken is the Global Food Lead Scientist for the World Wildlife Fund. Bruce Friedrich is co-founder and president of the Global Food Institute, and now a best-selling author of the book, Meat. Mittenthal is the chief strategy officer of the North American Meat Institute. Lasse Bruun is the UN Foundation's Director for Climate and Food. Shirley Tarawali is an Assistant Director General and Secretary to the International Livestock Research Institute, our co-host for the FSFI co-host for today's conversation. And finally, but not least, is Sira Secka from the Gambia, who is the founder and president of Enenn Foof Excellence Foundation. Let's just jump right into this conversation. Brent, which planetary boundaries are most stressed by current food systems, and where is particularly animal protein production most implicated?
Well, thanks for hosting this conversation, and thanks for hosting it on Earth Day, because when we're talking about the Earth, there is no solution that is front and center to the Earth other than really fixing our food system. Now, which planetary boundaries are most at stress? Biodiversity is one of the biggest ones. And approximately 80% of all of the Earth's biodiversity is impacted by food in some way. Water is stressed. Land use is also really, really stressed. So when you look at the planetary boundaries, food systems are by far the largest impactor of them. And when you look at the foods that we actually produce and eat, it's animal source foods that, singularly have the largest impact. Now, just to frame the actual question that we're starting with is how do we produce food within planetary boundaries? We can do that, and we call that nature positive production. However, we can't just talk about the production side. We also have to address the consumption side, because the two are linked within food systems, is that we can't really talk about one without, talking about the other. We tend to talk about the production side more, but we also have to talk about how much animals and animal source foods we are eating, consuming in different parts of the world.
Appreciate that answer very, very much. And building on just where you ended, Brent, let me go to Shirley and ask, how do these environmental pressures show up in regions where food systems are still developing and where protein access of any kind remains a challenge?
Thank you very much, Ertharin, and it's great to co-host this with you. In fact, what we see, especially the pressure from climate change, it has multiple impacts. And for livestock systems in lower middle income countries in particular, you see dimensions both of needing to mitigate exactly what Brent just said. We have to mitigate the emissions coming from livestock systems, from small-scale systems, but at the same time, we see a pressure of climate change that requires adaptation and resilience at the same time. And what I always like to say is, when we look at livestock systems, small-scale systems, which are usually crop systems as well, or very often, I have to say, there's real opportunities to address both of those at the same time. I like to call it the currency of sustainable livestock. On the one side, you have adaptation, and on the other side, you have mitigation. And any solution you bring for one or the other, most often, almost always, has a positive impact on the other one. If you try solutions to mitigate, you're strengthening adaptation and resilience. If you're helping with adaptation and resilience, you're also likely to be mitigating greenhouse gas emissions.
Mm-hmm. And that's a interesting way of pulling this all together, with the recognition that you don't pit one against the other, because too often the conversation we hear is either adaptation or mitigation. But what you're saying is that identifying as a necessity for both, and how investing in one supports the other. Sira, let me come to you. Drawing on your role within the UNFCCC process, how are these intersecting pressures, the rising protein demand, climate constraints, and unequal access, being negotiated and prioritized by low and middle income countries, that it's in line with or in conflict with what you just heard from Shirley and Brent?
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful question, and hello, colleagues and audience. Very important question, and considering how diverse the world is, when it comes to the needs and the availabilities, I think it's a very sensitive topic when we talk about food and diet and sustainability. And so when we're looking at low income, middle income, and high income areas, as to how do we produce, what can we produce, and what do we consume, I think, as you said from the beginning, there is no one way, one right approach. We really need to rethink about the need in that particular area. What works for Gambia and Senegal might not work in other regions. And so I think looking back to the UNFCCC process, with the negotiation with just everybody, for particularly my region, and a lot of LDCs, countries, and other areas, it is very important that adaptation is at the key of the front line, considering how vulnerable our farmers are, how vulnerable agriculture is, and how malnourished the region is. But then, as we rightly said, when we are adopting or when we are looking at the issues of adaptation, we might be technically also mitigating. So it's a holistic approach. And from the first speaker, what is more at risk now when we look at the climate, land and biodiversity. This is a first-hand experience with my farmers. We have currently graduates from the university that are in the lands, in the middle of the forest, leave their families, leave their children and everything, trying to produce, trying to move on with their careers. But 2 weeks ago, wildfire came out from nowhere. Burned down the gardens, burned down the farms, and destroyed thousands of lives, plants and animals in the forest. So we are at a high risk, and I think there's no one right answer, but it's a collective and global solutions that we need to be talking about.
Sira, where you began is where I'd like to open up a question for anyone on the panel who wants to answer it, because we talk about mitigation and adaptation and what needs to be done and the challenges that we are facing and what those solutions are for addressing those challenges. And some would argue that we're oversimplifying the nature of the challenge. You're pointing to the fact of intervening acts like fires, and would suggest that this is not a simple pathway. So I would ask to the panel, are we oversimplifying? And if it's this simple, where are the most consequential simplifications occurring, and how do we frame the potential interventions and trade-offs and prioritize the right pathways to achieve what may be, what I would argue is much more complex and complicated than simply suggesting we need to focus on adaptation and mitigation? Anyone, please.
I'll be happy to come in on that, Ertharin.
Come on, Lasse.
Well, I mean, it's not simple. It's very, very, very complicated. But I think what we can agree on globally is a theory of transformation, acknowledging there's very different theories of change within the respective countries. And the common denominator, for me at least, is about equity. If you look at how the energy system has evolved over the last 50 years, there was the terminology of a common but differentiated responsibility framework set up, which means that we all need to do our best, but those who pollute the most, those who emit the most, they need to take a bigger responsibility. And you cannot have very high per capita emissions in one country and then blaming very low emissions in low and middle income countries. And the same kind of applies to this. It is about equitable distribution. We simply cannot continue with the status quo of meat production, let alone any increase But the problem is really not in the low and middle income countries. Quite the contrary, as Tarawali would be much better at saying, smallholder farmers, indigenous people, women, pastoralists, fisher folk, they're the people who are really feeding people in low and middle income countries. The problem is not there. Quite the contrary. There's a very good connection between ecology, biodiversity protection, and the right livestock production. And also looking at the different livestock breeds that are being used in low and middle income countries, breeds that are works very well with stress, heat tolerance, or disease resistance, and can thrive in harsh environments, as opposed to those who are used in industrialized livestock systems in the global north. So what I'm trying to say here is that there needs to be much better access to nutritious and abundant food across the world. And in low and middle income countries, we need to address the aspects of nutrition insecurity. And there needs to be better access to better animal-based and plant-based nutrition. But to do that, to kind of like equate this out, we need to see a decrease in emissions from livestock production in global north, from the so-called concentrated animal feeding operations. And to do that, we have to address the levels as well. We can talk about technical solutions like feed emission mitigators, like additives to feed and so forth. But overall, we need to cut down. And it's about being fair. It's essentially about fairness. It's not fair that the average American eats between 100 and 120 kilos per capita per year, whereas the average African across the continent eats 8 to 12 kilos. It's simply not fair. It needs to be evened out.
Well, that equity question is one that we could spend the balance of this conversation talking about. But let's break it into pieces. And first of all, I'm going to start with you, Eric, because this has been somewhat of a binary conversation, talking about animal protein and the impacts on planetary health and the planetary boundaries. But what would constitute the measurable the progress in improving the sustainability of animal protein systems that goes beyond the efficiency gains to demonstrate alignment with planetary boundaries while preserving the livestock, the livelihoods, and particularly of smallholder farmers, and expanding access to lower income populations? Because if we are developing solutions that are only for high income populations, we are not developing solutions for the globe. Yeah, and I see your hand, Bruce, and let's let Eric come in on this question, and then I'll come right over to you.
Yeah, I think kind of tagging along with this conversation, it is very complex. And I would say that even in the US, in North America, food insecurity exists, nutrient deficiency exists, and I think we have to be able to address those effectively. And that includes insufficiency related to nutrients that are very common in animal protein products. And so it's very hard to speak in generalities to say certain regions need to do one thing, certain regions need to do another thing. I think we really need to look at the whole system and how can we make improvements across the whole system to ensure that people have access to the nutrient-dense foods that they are seeking out, that align with cultural contexts, and are helping to support a healthy planet. In the US currently, we have the smallest beef herd that we've had in decades. There are many reasons behind that, but in terms of the impact, when you have a much smaller herd like that, it is going to reduce the overall climate impacts. But we are working with the supply chain as a whole to ensure that we are providing resources to farmers and ranchers and processors and restaurants and retailers to lower our impacts as much as possible. And it's not just about production efficiency. That's one piece of the equation. But it's about how do we bring together technologies, whether it's feed additives, whether it's vaccines, whether it's genetics. There are all kinds of different pathways we can take, and it requires all of them working together. And so we work very closely with producers to identify those and determine what makes the most sense for each individual operation and how to make those accessible for farmers and ranchers, because they're running businesses too. And so we need to make sure that we're working very closely with those business people so that they can adapt and determine what makes the most sense for their own operations to reduce their impacts and play a role in this big global conversation.
And Bruce, I want to come over to you because there's a lot there to unpack on what Eric was just saying. But many would suggest that we need to realistically understand the contribution of complementary and alternative proteins, which offer within this diversity of global protein portfolio, in addition to the more sustainable production of animal protein that Eric was just describing. But particularly in terms of scale and affordability, and can alternative and complementary proteins scale and become more affordable to meet the rising demand of protein, as well as to address the challenges of our protein consumption today, production and consumption, on environmental health that Brent was describing at the start of the conversation?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ertharin. And I really love the explicit all of the above framing of this entire panel and just really everything that FSFI does. There are not silver bullets, and I think it's useful for us to really recognize that we're going to need the varied solutions that you're talking about. There's just a huge divergence of food systems all over the world, and I really resonate with Lasse's precise framing as well. And then, Eric was talking about some of the immediate interventions that are so important. And then I think we also need the sort of longer term systemic solutions that can shift entire food system economic relationships. And so, I think it's worth remembering every year since the FAO started measuring in 1961, with the exception of a small blip for mad cow disease, a small blip for African swine fever, followed by COVID. But every single year, other than those three blips, meat consumption has gone up. And that's not for lack of trying on the part of people who would like to see that change. Even in the US, the last 5 years, I think, have been the highest 5 years for meat consumption. All of the analysis indicates that, again, absent economic shocks or animal diseases, we're going to see that keep happening. And that's a problem from a climate standpoint when you realize that, current projections from the World Resources Institute are business as usual. We're going to have 1.3 gigatons more emissions from animal agriculture. And all of the short-term solutions put together, according to the World Bank, will mitigate about 800 megatons. So that's a lot of emissions mitigation. We should do all of the things that Eric is talking about, but we also need to address the idea that we're going to have something like 200 million more metric tons in 2050 of meat production. And that's where alternative proteins comes in. They require far less land. They create far fewer emissions. They also have global health and other benefits. And we're very early days. So yes, they're too expensive now. And they're also not good enough. But flashback 10 years, and the International Energy Agency was saying solar is always going to be prohibitively expensive. Electric vehicles are always, the world's experts are going to be prohibitively expensive. So the reason I wrote the book, and thank you very much for your kind endorsement of the book, but the reason I wrote the book was to say both A, the science can work. We can get to price and taste parity. But B, lots of innovations either A, take far longer than they should have, or B, don't happen at all because we don't bring the will. So we really do need an all of the above focus, and alternative protein should be a part of that. Even if only to take up some of the 200 million metric tons of additional meat that's going to be eaten, between now every year by 2050. We really do need to be thinking about what we do there. From both a land use / biodiversity vantage and also mitigation of emissions.
And 200 million tons. That's a number that I think our audience should ponder when we think not just about the land that the would be required to support, but the feed and the water that would be required to support. I see hands, and so let's just take it from there, starting with you, Shirley, then over to you, Sira, and followed by Brent. Shirley.
Thanks, Ertharin. The conversation is evolving in a very interesting way. For me, the two key words, and you mentioned them at the beginning, relate to diversity and pathways. I think we need to really recognize that we're starting from many, many different places, different systems, a whole mixture, I think Sira touched on it, of different products being produced. And if we look across Africa and Asia, by probably 500 million smallholder farmers producing both crops and livestock in a very integrated way, not producing enough for the protein needs, but there's a mixture of things there. So what's the pathway that we can support through multiple collaborations across all types of stakeholders to enable those systems to evolve? Yes, perhaps in some cases it is more efficient production of animal foods, not just meat, dairy and eggs, and even in some cases it's aquaculture as well. But also the other things that are being produced, the beans and the corn and the wheat or whatever it might be, the vegetables Sira was just talking about. How can we start from those places and help to transition those systems towards a much more balanced production? Because it's what's being produced that's what's being consumed. We had a discussion late last year with some of the Eat Lancet authors, where they looked at the environment, they looked at the food and health space, the planetary boundaries, we should say perhaps, but they also looked at the equity space. And one of the things we saw from their work is that in Africa, that's where the biggest gap is for production. And you have the biggest opportunity because the levels of consumption are not they're not maxed out yet. Most people are getting far less than they need. So there's a real opportunity to both address smart production, but also to make sure that that doesn't go above where it should go. It's going to be much, much harder to bring people down from where they've gone above that level. Let me stop there. Pathways and diversity.
And that's we're hearing that a theme through this conversation on the challenges of our system on biodiversity and the impact of our failure to change on the where we are projected to go in the future. Sira, over to you.
I think it's amazing to come in after Shirley with just what you said, very on point, very aligned. And before you start, I was like, we're on point. We need to really look at not just the lack of protein in some region and the overly consuming protein in other regions, but then also even like the quality, the diet quality. But then I'm just gonna hit right on your point because this is something that we've been discussing for a really long time. And coming up from my region, the gap in consumption and the gap in production is unquestionable. And right now, as we are going into the raining season, because we're tropical, in June, we're going to start to have natural rain that even though there's huge climate crisis, but the rain is still going to come. And it's fresh water that is coming from, and we have access to that. There's access to the land. For example, if I describe Gambia I can say it is divided into two. You have the North Bank and the South Bank. In the North Bank, where my family is from, they have been farming for decade and decade and decade. The soil is there, the ground is there, it is deforested. They still farm on it and they still produce. But then going on the South Bank, still a lot of forest, still a lot of land, very fertile, that you can pretty much grow anything and everything. And we have abundance of sunlight. So I still ask myself, what is the problem with the region being able to produce enough food, even if not for economic, but to feed its people? People were very scared, and I think we're still scared when the problem with the energy just arise with transportation, that if we stop importation of food, places like Gambia, people are going to starve to death in 1 month. We don't have a food reserve, but we have the space to produce enough for the country. So where is the problem? Now, coming back to one of the points about how many tons of meat, protein meat, is being produced and consumed in some regions like America and the like. It is also scary because you're looking at the health impact on that. You're looking at other places that maybe eat meat once a year. Some cultures and some communities, they eat meat during holidays, like Tobaski, that they have to sacrifice an animal. That's the time they eat meat. And you know that in some places you have meat that is being wasted, that is being overly consumed, that is affecting health, obesity, and all that. So where is the missing link? How do we maybe then think about cutting down from those ones and then expanding to the rest of the world to even set out that equity like Lasse is talking about? So I think it's really all of our responsibilities, all of our the work to put together and just ask the simple question of what is the goal as a globe, as human beings, to survive on this planet, to save the planet, save ourselves, and save everyone else. What is one goal that we want to achieve? And hopefully, if we have some kind of answer and explanation to that, we can kind of work towards that. The sooner the better, because we're running out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sira, and very thank you for that very passionate and human response to the challenge of our production system today. In answer to your question, what is that shared goal? That is a shared goal, is what brings us together here today. This is the transformation of the food system for human health, as you've been pointing out, as well as environmental health, and as Shirley has been pointing out, to support the economic return that is necessary for all of the actors across the food system, as Eric reminds us, with livestock farmers and others. But how do we do that across the entire globe in an equitable and just way?
That is the question.
Which is why, Brent, I'm going to come to you right now, because you started us off with an understanding of what those planetary boundaries are that we are now challenging with our system. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I'd also ask you to help me answer Sira's question, and the question that I think that many across the developing world ask of us regularly.
Yeah, I mean, thank God we're finally starting to wake up to the fact that the food system impacts are the #1 impacts on this planet when we're talking about health and environmental impacts. And it's taken a while for us to get there, but thank God we're finally got to the point where we're recognizing that we have to address food systems. But I just want to expand this conversation a little bit beyond protein. And there's been some people that are hinting at it, because it's not just about protein. And the world is crazy about protein right now. There's protein shakes, there's protein this, and get protein and protein bars, and everybody's eating protein. But protein is not really the problem. And I understand that, because the main impacts come from the protein sources, whether it's animal source foods and that transition from animal source foods to more plant-based proteins. But with the first Eat Lancet report, what we really tried to do is say, it's not just about protein, it's about a healthy diet. And it's about a healthy diet for every single person on this planet. And what does that look like? And when we came up with the planetary health diet, we put a very strong firewall between the environmental impacts and the health impacts. And we said, let's design a diet just that would optimize human health, period. Not a diet that would optimize the environmental impacts or lower impacts. It was, what is a diet that would optimize our health? That is a planetary health diet. Then we modeled and said, is it possible to produce that diet within planetary boundaries? And lo and behold, we were able to, right? And Eat Lancet 2.0 verified that and added some other very important boundaries, like justice, and which was lacking from the first. But we very clearly outlined and said it's about human health for every single person. And when you look at that diet in terms of complex or being simple, it's pretty simple. It's cutting down on animal source foods in places where we're overeating it, and in places where they're undereating it, they're going to have more, right? It's 5 servings of animal source foods per week from a variety of sources, which is going back to what a lot of very traditional eating patterns that we used to have, and it's producing it with less impacts. And we can't just focus on the production side. We can't just focus on the protein side. We have to focus on both sides of them, and we have to look at the whole system. So just want to challenge us and say, when we're thinking about this, let's really be thinking about healthy diets. And if we're talking about one goal for us, we have to ensure that every single person on this planet has access to affordable, healthy diets that are diverse, that are culturally appropriate, that are local, and everybody can actually afford that, right? Right now we don't have that. And if there's one fundamental goal, if we can achieve that, that will get us a long way in terms of being able to transform our food systems.
Well, let me go right over to you, Lasse, because as the representative here from the UN Foundation, the multilateral organizations have been working to help us try and achieve this goal. But we're not there. And we're not even talking about the 2030 goals as a community of interest, beyond our community of interest anymore. So you can come in with the statements that you were going to make, but I would ask you to pick up where Brent left off on that single goal that we should all share which is global access to a affordable, diverse, and healthy diet.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, and it's great, and I love what you always go different directions. I make that makes these conversations so vivid. Well, I mean, frankly, it's embarrassing that we have a planet where we have about 1 billion people who are undernourished, living in hunger, and 1 billion people living who are obese. I mean, if you always talk about future generations judging what we do now, this is going to be one of the things people look back at and saying, what is going on there? And I talked a lot about equity before. The other thing is talk about long-term resilience. Every year, the Earth overshoot date, where we have used up all the resources of the planet respective to the size of the planet, it's coming sooner and sooner every year. We need to find ways of building long-term resilience. That also means then we talked about differentiated responsibility to the different ways of producing food. Whereas Bruce talked about we need to address the insatiable hunger for meat. Maybe we cannot take away the meat, but we need to make sure people get the right meat that has less impact. Whereas in many low and middle income countries, before we get to a point where they also might be engaging much more in alternative protein, we need to say how can we address the long-term resilience there. And one of the ways to do that is also looking at what is accessible right now and affordable. And there's a lot of work going into looking at beans, pulses, and legumes, simply because they're very weather resilient, they're very drought resilient, and they are very nutritious, and they feed the soil as well, and they work very well in combination with pastoralist and livestock systems. And there are initiatives by World Food Program and UNICEF to work with local communities, and it's going quite well. But if you look at the bigger picture, the more long term, we need to ensure that all the UN institutions that are very sometimes differentiated, Ertharin, World Food Program very well. But the World Food Program work together with IFAD, with FAO, with GAIN and others to have this joint approach to it and talk about long-term resilience, and also in low and middle income countries. It's crucial that we take that approach. And practically, that means that we need to maybe turn things around. And instead of saying, well, we need to provide better ODI, better development services to low and middle income countries, we need to start developing that long-term resilience. And that cannot be driven by a global north agenda. That cannot be driven by in building CAFOs in low and middle income countries, because they drive smallholder pastoralists out of work. They destroy the local environment. We need to work with the terms and the conditions of the people leading those places. So concretely, I'm very excited about COP32 taking place in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia next year, because I really hope that's going to be a massive food COP that really focuses on how Africa as a continent can become one of the leaders in shifting the global food system. And for once, we have a conversation that starts in Africa and spreads elsewhere, as opposed to being the other way around.
Well, that would make for a change of pace, wouldn't it? If we had that as the start for the conversation of what does with Africa leading the global conversation on food systems transformation. Bruce, over to you. But Lasse made a point of talking about 1 billion people who are undernourished and 1 billion people who suffer from obesity across the globe. What you didn't talk about was the 3.1 billion people who can't afford a diverse and nutritious diet. And as we expand this conversation beyond just protein to talk about that diversity of diet that you started us on, and when you began your intervention on alternative proteins, how do we ensure that as we're creating that diversity of diet, that diversity of diet is affordable?
Yeah, I think that's so critically important, Ertharin. And I think we need all of the short-term solutions that people are already talking about. But just, I want to just take a step back. Like multiple people on this call have said, we need to challenge ourselves. We need to eat less meat in developed economies. Somebody said if we can achieve that, pointing to the Eat Lancet report. I mean, it is a consensus. All of the models that keep climate change within even 2 degrees relative to pre-industrial levels, all of them assume decreased meat consumption, and none of them are even hand-wavy about how that might happen after, probably 60 plus years of trying. And I don't think we're going to come up with some new solution that convinces people in developed economies to eat less meat. I mean, even in Europe, it's, maybe flatlining, but it's not going down. And the rest of the world, it's skyrocketing. So just like the world is not going to consume less energy, so sure, let's have more energy efficient buildings and light bulbs and encourage people to walk. Let's do all of it. But we really do need renewables in the same way that we need renewables in EVs. We do need to figure out how to make meat from plants that is affordable. And we do need to figure out how to cultivate actual animal meat in factories that is affordable. And the trajectory is good on both those things. And we right now feed more than 1.4 billion metric tons of crops to farm animals. Back when it was about 750 million metric tons, the UN Special Envoy on Food, Jean Ziegler, he called it a human rights crime that biofuels was getting so many crops and driving up prices for those 3.1 billion people now, according to FAO, who are priced out of a healthy diet. And now we're feeding more than twice that number of crops to farm animals. It does drive up prices. McKinsey analysis for Climate Works Foundation said that a shift in the direction of plant-based meat and cultivated meat would decrease prices for both plant foods and for meat. This is, further to what Lasse said, the pressure on smallholders, the pressure on pastoralists, the pressure on subsistence fishing communities is the massive industrialization of meat and fish production. So we really do need to give people plant-based meat that is competitive on price and taste, because people are not going to sacrifice on taste. They love the taste of meat. They're not going to pay more. And fortunately, the efficiencies of these technologies, plant-based meat and cultivated meat, mean that at scale, they should be able to compete on both price and taste. So we need all of the short-term solutions, everything people are talking about here. But we also do need to recognize that this is the renewable energy of food, and it needs to play a significant part.
The renewable energy of food. If there was one takeaway that we hope our listeners will embrace, I think it's that idea. So, Eric, let me come to you. I know our time's getting short, but let me come to you because you've heard a lot about the need for reduction in consumption of animal-based protein, and the challenges of the production system of today and the potential challenges as we are seeing an exponential increase in the consumption of animal-based protein. How do you respond? How does the industry respond?
Yeah, it's a really interesting discussion, and thank you to Bruce for highlighting the trends that are that have occurred over the last several years. I think a lot of this discussion has focused on some of the recommendations from the Eat Lancet diet, which if you look at consumption patterns around the world, is a pretty extreme recommendation. And it's something that has been thoroughly criticized from the scientific community. And there are certainly a lot of concerns about that level of animal protein consumption being the recommendation. I would stress, and kind of going back to FAO's recommendation, that the animal source foods are uniquely nutrient dense, and meat is uniquely nutrient dense that can't easily be replaced by other products. And I think we really need to look at nutrient density and the amount of nutrition that are packed into products, and the way that we can leverage those together. Animal protein is a very nutrient dense product, and plant proteins, fruits and vegetables are very nutrient dense as well. And so those can work together very effectively to feed people and help people have a healthy dietary pattern. If you think about the need to eat more beans and legumes, there's really good research out there that shows that if you pair those with meat, people eat more beans and legumes. And so meat can be a really strong pathway to help people enjoy additional proteins as well. Think about Brussels sprouts, particularly in the U.S. context. I don't know how it's played out elsewhere around the world, but when I was a kid, Brussels sprouts were kind of like, oh, Brussels sprouts, like you would never want to eat those. A chef came up with the idea to pair them with bacon, and suddenly Brussels sprouts are immensely popular. And so again, meat and plants working together, and it doesn't just work from a nutrition perspective, but animals are able to upcycle plant agriculture and raising crops very effectively. And so we need to make the use of all of the systems working together to reduce our impacts as much as possible. And as we grow more plants, using those to feed animals is a critical part of that solution.
Okay, I too, Bruce, love Brussels sprouts. But to Eric, as you talk about the combination of plant and animal proteins, we often talk about complementary proteins as opposed to alternative proteins that we may want to think about. Plant-based proteins and some of the other new foods coming online. It's complementary and with an opportunity to reduce the consumption of animal-based proteins, but recognizing the ongoing consumer demand. Brent, let me go over to you for a short intervention in the conversation.
Yeah, just to respond to Eric, and I agree about your response about the criticisms of the Eat Lancet, and a lot of people said that we were trying to promote a vegan or vegetarian diet, but that was not true. There's a lot of meat within this diet that we have proposed, and it's based on the science in terms of what we should be eating for our health. But just to build on something that Bruce was saying too, in terms of the renewable energy of the food system, or the renewable of the food system, whatever you said, Bruce. What are the differences between the food system and the energy system? Is the energy system, luckily, when you think about wind and solar, there's a lot of wind and solar. I mean, there's unlimited amounts of solar energy, but we don't have unlimited amounts of land. We're fundamentally constrained by land, and that is the difference with the food system. So working within that constraint forces constraints in terms of what we're eating as well too. And that's why some of the profound shifts that we're talking about, the only way that we will be able to live within planetary boundaries is to be able to address that fundamental constraint and to work with it. And part of that really involves rebalancing what we're eating.
And I think too, and I don't want to answer for you, Bruce, but I think what Bruce was saying was that and he's agreeing with you, Brent, that we need to think about alternative proteins as in the same spirit that we think about renewable energy, as supporting the reduction in fossil-based excuse me, fossil-based energy sources through the use of renewable energy. He's saying the same thing about alternative proteins, that if we have increased the consumption of alternative proteins, it will allow us to support the diet diversity that is required, but while also addressing the challenges of planetary boundaries and the health of the planet. Shirley, over to you.
I think what we're hearing is that there are not endless, but there are many solutions. And really, the problem is so big that we need all of them. We need beans and legumes, and we need meat, milk, eggs. We need complementary proteins. But we need to be really smart about where we prioritize what, based on what it looks like today. What is it that we're starting with that we're going to transform? But I think there's another piece that we haven't touched on. The world we're in now, we see aid declining. So how are we going to resource this? And I've been looking recently at some publications and was in Vietnam recently looking at sustainable livestock transformation in that part of the world. Really, the challenge is how do we get perhaps aid, perhaps information on sector priorities, whatever they may be, that really fit with the ecologies to be transformed and the dietary needs? How do we get those pieces financed? And that requires a lot of connections across many stakeholders, and it requires the national coffers, if you like, to also be involved in using the aid money as a sort of catalyst, a catalyst for whether it's government money or it's private sector investment, but guided by this overall, how are we going to transform things?
And Shirley, thanks for bringing us back to a recognition of the need for diversity of solutions. And what I think where everyone has agreed that we want to avoid, not just in this conversation, but as a community of interest, is in pitting one solution against another, and recognizing the need for a diversity of solution that supports human health as well as environmental health. And your last point on financing, Lasse, I want to if I know you have your hand up for a reason, but I have a question for you. As we look across the current flow of capital from public, private, and philanthropic capital, are the investment patterns that actively shaping the evolution of the global protein and diet solutions in a detrimental way? And if so, how? And how should we think about what is necessary from a finance standpoint to support this diversity of solutions across the globe?
Yes, great point. And just to say as well, I very much agree with what Shirley was saying before. Well, we know, unfortunately, that way too much money is going into the wrong systems, particularly intensive livestock production, the so-called concentrated animal feeding operations, that are a problem from an environmental perspective. We already talked about something we haven't touched on yet is zoonotic diseases. If you ask the World Health Organization what they really are afraid of, what they need to mitigate and what they want to invest in, is moving away from intensive livestock production, because it is very dangerous because of the overuse of antibiotics. So there's an investment side there as well. I maybe want to draw the attention to the initiative that was launched by Brazil at COP30, the so-called RAIS, which is about repopulating and regaining natural soil health for depleted soils across the globe, particularly in Brazil. And why are they doing that? It's because Brazil and the other stakeholders have been engaging other countries. They have realized that intensive animal agriculture is not good for the planet, but also not good for the investment. It's a short-term investment that often leads to the soil depleted. So they're saying, well, how can we reinvest things in a way that builds long-term resilience and equity as well? And that is by rewilding and creating systems that combine extensive animal agriculture with crop production using regenerative agriculture, agroecology, and so forth. And in addition to that, to your question, Ertharin, is around the net employment gains when you shift to that system. So plant-based and diversified systems that I just talked about are much more labor-intensive per unit of output. That means that when you do legume production, horticulture, you can actually increase the rural employment diversity a lot, which means that it's not a question of where the jobs lie right now. It's where like what type of rural economy is built. And to build better rural economies by shifting these current systems in the global north and boosting access to nutrients and thereby creating nutrient food production for people in low middle income countries, we need to really focus on jigging or reshifting the way the funding is going now. So that means at a national level, that means from a level from ODA, from IMF, World Bank, African Development Bank, and so forth, where there's still a focus on building systems that provide very short-term nutrients to people, as in like chicken farms, as opposed to focusing on what institutions such as the Pan-African Bean Research Alliance is looking into, building long-term resilient access to nutrients in rural economies, for instance. And the best way to address that is like what I said, looking forward to COP32, where there's going to be hopefully a much stronger focus on African leadership within this, but also looking into what countries are doing and making sure that in their national determined contributions within climate change, the focus on agriculture, in particular building long-term resilient, is not looking to feeding people animal protein in the short term, but rather building long-term protections. And the good news is that if you do this in the right way, research by the International Labour Organization and the Inter-American Development Bank shows that you actually create more jobs, better jobs, safer jobs, more gender equitable jobs. So it's a win-win-win. So if we do this the right way, we'll not only convince the ministries of climate and the ministries of agriculture, we can also convince the ministries of finance that this is the best way going forward.
Okay, so I would love to dig more into, there's so many things that you put on the table there, Lasse, but we only have 4 minutes left. And so I'm going to start with you, Sira, but I want to go through the entire panel and ask each one of you to give me one sentence and one idea on what is necessary to move us from the conversation of a diversity of solutions to support planetary and human health to the action that is necessary to deliver the outcomes of a food system that supports planetary and human health. So, Sira, let's start with you.
Yes, thank you for that question. And just very straightforward, it needs to be content specific. I was going to add to that when I raised my hand. We really need to look at how we align production with local ecosystems and culture. I wanted to dive more into culture, but I know we don't have time.
Okay,
It's very
so let's say
important to
that's
link
one. It
culture.
must be context,
Yes.
specific.
And then also bringing everyone on
One.
board. Yes, content specific.
Context specific.
We cannot end this conversation. Thank you so much. It's amazing.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Eric, over to you. What is that one priority that we need to move us to action?
I really think it's collaboration and finding common ground across a range of actors. One thing that's been a little disappointing to me about this conversation is I hear a lot of North versus South, large versus small, meat versus plants. That's not going to get us further in this conversation. How do we work together, and how do we do so in the areas that we agree upon and find solutions that way?
Well, we scheduled the conversation as a collaboration, and we brought in a diverse group of actors, and we heard the outcome. So collaboration we know is necessary. Bruce, over to you. You're on mute, Bruce.
Well, that's embarrassing. I'm sorry. We need to look at what's worked in energy transition. So I think multiple people here think that the world can't sustain 200 million metric tons more meat in 2050 than they're consuming now. If we just keep doing the same thing to try to address that, it seems very unlikely that that is going to work. We need to look for other solutions. I encourage people to look at complementary proteins.
Terrific. Lasse, over to you.
We need to find a way on agreeing what is an equitable, sustainable global consumption of meat and then what types of meat that is. If we do that, it's a good start.
Terrific. Brent.
Work with the stakeholders that are actually selling it, where people interact with food, and that's retailers and food and actually food service providers. And we're seeing huge traction in Europe with retailers that are already making this move. And if we can move retailers, we can move most of the population with us. So thanks.
Terrific. Shirley, as my co-host, you get the final word.
Thank you. For me, the key word is diversity. It's diversity of diet, diversity of production and production systems, diversity of funding sources, diversity of stakeholders and how they engage, and bringing those things together in a way that appreciates very different starting points. Food systems are going to change, and the question is, who's going to shape that?
That's a big question and a right question for us to end on. Sira, Eric, Bruce, Lasse, Brent, Shirley, thank you. And to the audience who joined us today, happy Earth Day. I'm Ertharin Cousin from Food Systems for the Future.
Thanks all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.